Building web apps with React is not just about composing components together and making sure that the logic works correctly. That arguably is the most important part, or at least it's the biggest reason for using React. But building React apps is also about styling those apps. You want to make sure that your applications look good. And styling is also an important part of building components. And there are different techniques for setting styles dynamically and for styling components such that other components are not affected by a specific component's styles. Therefore, in this module, we will dive into how you can set up styles in a conditional or dynamic way. So how you, for example, can switch certain styles based on some conditions. For example, if a user enters an invalid input and you want to color the input field red, something like that. And then we'll dive into two popular approaches for scoping styles to components. So for setting up styles such that they only affect a component and are not added as global styles. We'll have a look at styled components, which is a third-party library, a very popular one, which allows us to set up pre-styled components with their own scoped styles. And we'll have a look at a concept called CSS modules. And you will learn what these different approaches are all about, how you do work with them, and how you could add them to your next project. Now, to dive into styling, we need a demo project, and to mix things up, I got a brand new project here. Now, I already prepared this one for you. It's a very simple project, as you can tell. You can basically add course goals, like learn React, and that will be added to this list. You can also delete items from there by clicking on them, and that's basically it. This project uses only things which I covered over the last course sections. And of course, you find that project attached. You can simply download it. You find the entire project folder there. And then, once you downloaded it, simply open the terminal, navigate it into this project folder, and run npm install. This will install all the third-party packages which are required, since the attached folder does not come with a node modules folder, because that would unnecessarily bloat the attachment. npm install simply installs all packages and recreates the node modules folder. And thereafter, you have this project here, which you can start with npm start to start the development server and play around with the project. Of course, also feel free to dive into the source files to see how this project is structured. As I already said, this project only uses features which you already know, like use state and functions which are bound to events. And we're then, for example, also outputting lists of data dynamically by calling map. So that's all something you already saw, and there is nothing new there. This, however, will be our starting project for this section, where we are now going to dive into styling. So definitely explore the source code files so that you understand this project, and thereafter we're going to have a look at the different styling options React gives us. So as mentioned, we are going to work on this project, and therefore make sure that you have the project set up as instructed in the last course lecture. We actually already have some styling in this project, certainly not the worst one. I think it looks quite decent, but there are things we can do about this project nonetheless. For one, we might want to change the way styles are applied, because at the moment we are using regular CSS with regular CSS selectors, like this class selector. And as I mentioned, this style, even though we're importing it into the course goal list component, is not scoped to that component. It would affect any element on the entire page which has a goal list CSS class. So that's one thing we'll tackle. But we'll start with something different, with setting styles dynamically. And a great example can be found in the course input component. There we are collecting some input by the user, and then we have the add goal button to, well, add a goal. In the moment, we can press that add goal button even if we didn't enter anything, and the result is that we add an empty element here. Now, in most applications, we probably want to avoid this. And we don't just want to avoid this, we also want to give the user some feedback about the incorrect input. And that's something we'll build now, and that's something for which we'll need to set styles dynamically. So in course input component, it's the form submit handler where I in the end want to check whether something valid was entered before we trigger that onAddGoal function. So that function we get on this onAddGoal prop, to be precise. For this, we can add a simple if statement here in the form submit handler and check if the entered value, if we trim it, trim is a built-in method that removes excess white space at the beginning or the end, and I use it here to rule out that the user just entered a bunch of blanks. So if we trim this and we check the length, if the length is now equal to 0, we know that the input is essentially empty. In that case, I want to return here. Hence, this line of code will not be executed because function execution stops when you return. And we're done. But the problem now is, now we made sure that we can't add empty goals. I'm hammering this button and it doesn't do anything. This works, however. But even though we added this, we don't give the user any feedback. And that's exactly where we now need our styling. I want to add a red border and a slightly red background color to that input, and also a red color to that label if the user entered something invalid here. Now, how can we achieve this? Well, we can manage an extra piece of state here, and that state could be an indicator for whether the user submitted and entered something valid or not. So it's a true or false choice, and therefore we'll be working with a Boolean. And initially, let's say, we trust the user. So initially we set this to true, and I'll name this state is valid, and the updating function set is valid. Now, as long as this is true, I consider the input as valid. If we make it into this if block, though, I know it's invalid, and therefore we can call set is valid and set this to false, because what the user entered and submitted definitely is not valid. Now, if this is false, I want to apply the styles I just said. And the easiest way of doing that is to add the inline style here to the label, for example. And as you learned, you need to set an object there. The inline style prop here wants an object as a value. And in that object, you target the different CSS style props in JavaScript that you can set for this element, for this component. So for example, here, the color property is available, and we could set this to red. But of course, we don't always want to set this to red, but only if the input is invalid. So I check if not is valid, and if that's the case, I set this to red. Otherwise, I set this to black, for example, which is the default color. And that should allow us to dynamically set this to a red color. We use the style prop, we pass an object to it as demanded, but we dynamically change the value that's fed into the color property in that style object. And therefore now if we save this and we go back, if I submit this without entering anything, you see that label becomes red. Currently we then never reset it, but that's a first important step. Now we need to also change the border and background color of this input, and that's definitely something you can try on your own. Here's a short break which you can take to pause the video. Thereafter, we'll implement it together. Were you successful? Well, adding it shouldn't be too hard. We add the style prop again, pass in an object because that's what it wants. And now we can set the border color, and that's the only tricky thing. It's border color written like this, because we're in JavaScript here, not in a CSS file, and therefore we need to use the JavaScript property name for that CSS property, and that happens to be the camel case version of the CSS property name, hence border color written like this. And I also want to set this to red if this is invalid. So the value is exactly the same as up here. And therefore, of course, we could also refactor this into a separate variable. For the moment, since I only need it in these two places, I'll keep it like this. And we also need a background. And here again, I check if this is invalid, in which case I colored it red, otherwise black. Now this red might actually be a bit too much, and therefore maybe here we want to use something else. I think salmon should be good. And that should not be black but transparent, because of course I don't want a black background in the input, I want a transparent one. With that, if we save this, now if I click add goal, it's colored like this. Now it's also never reset at the moment, but at least we got the conditional styling. And of course you can play around with the exact color values to, well, get a different styling. Now, 2 notes. For one, of course, we want to reset this eventually. And second, I'm not 100% happy with that, because with this approach we currently have here, we always set inline styles, which of course have the highest priority in CSS. So you override all other styles with that. Now actually I'm happy with the default styles we set up in course input. For example, for the input, I have a border color of this light grayish color here. Now, needless to say, we could set this up here as well. I could reset this to this grayish color, for example, instead of black, so that when we reset it, we go back to this predefined color we have in the CSS file. But still, we have some duplication here. We got a base color scheme here in the CSS file, and then we override this with inline styles just because we want to conditionally set some specific styles if the input is invalid. And that's why I'm not 100% happy with those inline styles. So let's now quickly work on the reset functionality before I then show you an alternative to setting dynamic styles with inline styles. Now, to work on that reset functionality though, all we need to do is go to the place where we react to every keystroke. And in the end, we just need to check if event target value, which is the entered text, if that is now basically valid. So if we trim it and get the length, if the length is greater than 0, if it is, we know the input is valid, and then we could call set is valid and set this to true again. And here, of course, we need a dot. And with that, if we go back, if I submit this, this is red, but if I start typing, you see it's no longer invalid. But if I submit it in an invalid form, it of course still becomes red. So that's working, but as I mentioned, for the reasons I mentioned, I'm not 100% happy with the inline styles because they take a very high priority, and you can certainly always find ways of making it work, but I personally would prefer to not set inline styles. So let's have a look at an alternative. Which alternative could we have to setting inline styles? Well, how about the following alternative? What if we could add a new CSS class to this div, which holds both the label and the input, and we would add this class dynamically only if the value entered is invalid. That could be something like a invalid class here. The name is totally up to you. So this invalid class should sometimes be added here on this div. And then in CSS, we could prepare the fitting styles. For example, here we could say, if the form control also has the invalid class, and therefore make sure there is no space between form control and this dot, which means they both have to be on the same element, then we could target our input and set the border color to red. And we could set the background to red, or actually now pick a much lighter version, like this very light rose color here. And if the form control, the div with the class form control, has a class of invalid, we can also target the label and set its color to red. So these here would be 2 CSS rules that should lead to the desired output. And all we need to do for these rules to have an effect is we need to add that invalid class dynamically. And here's how you can add classes dynamically. Let's get rid of these inline styles, we don't need them anymore. And instead, let's see how we can change this class dynamically. It's very, very easy. Since we need a dynamic value, we need curly braces. Because a string is always a string. It's a hard-coded string, so we need curly braces. And now what we feed in, of course, still can be a string of form control. But a string where we dynamically add more text in it, where we dynamically expand it or concatenate a value to have this string, invalid, instead of this string. So what we pass to class name on this div sometimes is a string that looks like this, and sometimes will be a string that looks like this, depending on what the user entered and depending on our isValid state. And for that, we can use a nice construct. We can use backticks here. Now, in case you're not familiar with this is a default JavaScript feature. It's called a template literal. This constructs a string, but we have backticks here, not single quotes, but backticks. It's a special character on your keyboard. And whatever you type between there will be treated as a regular string. So we can add form control here. But, and that's now the tricky thing, you can also inject a dynamic value into that string with a special syntax which looks like this: $, and then again a pair of curly braces opening and closing. This adds content into the string, and what you pass between these curly braces can be any JavaScript expression. So a lot like our curly braces inside of JSX, here now inside of the template literal. So here we could now check if isValid is not true, hence the exclamation mark at the beginning. And if that's the case, we insert invalid here into this long string. Otherwise, we enter nothing or simply an empty string in this case. So that simply will make sure that class name is either set to a string which has only form control blank nothing, or to a string which is form control blank invalid. So therefore now if we save this, if I submit this in an empty state, I get my error look here, my error style. But other than that, if I start typing, I go back to the non-error style because we dynamically add this invalid class. And of course, you can inject multiple things into that string, so you could repeat the same technique to add more dynamically added classes. And that's very powerful because now you're back to working with CSS files and with classes only. And you can dynamically add or remove classes with this simple syntax. And it will be React's job to actually add or remove the classes in the DOM. You do what you can do best in React. You specify a goal, you specify some alternative states, for example, that the goal sometimes is to have just form control and sometimes form control and invalid, and React will make sure that the DOM, the real DOM, is updated accordingly. This is React in action, and this is how you can add styles dynamically. Being able to set styles and classes dynamically is super important, and you now learned how you can achieve this in React code. Now let's move to something else, and that would be the styling itself. Currently, we're using just CSS for that. Regular CSS files with regular selectors, mostly class selectors, but also sometimes combined with tag selectors, for example. We're importing these files into our component files, but as I emphasized multiple times, this does not result in those styles being scoped to this component only. So that means that if we had any other element anywhere else in the DOM that had a form control CSS class on it, this style, for example, would target it and would affect it. So it's not like we only care about form control elements in this component. No, every element on the entire page is affected because by default, those styles are not scoped. Now, that is not necessarily a problem. You can, of course, be careful about your selectors. You can use class selectors or ID selectors here. It is regular CSS after all. You can use any selector. And you can ensure that the IDs and the classes you are selecting are only used in the places where you want to apply the styling. But of course, especially in larger projects, potentially with a lot of developers working on the code, it could happen that a name is used twice. That form control, for example, is used in different parts of the application, and therefore, unfortunately, styles spill over to our components, and you might want to avoid this. And there are various ways of avoiding this, and I will show you the two most popular approaches, therefore. Approach number one is to use a package called styled components. And you can just search for styled components to find their official web page. Now on this page, you can learn all about styled components. Here, I will only introduce you to the package. If you want to use it, you can dive way deeper into it with those docs, but I will give you a thorough introduction, no worries. Styled components is a package that helps you build, guess what, components which have certain styles attached to them, where the styles really only affect the components to which they were attached and not any other components. Now, to get started, we need to install that package. And here you see the command you need to run for that. Now, if you've never installed packages before, keep in mind that our project here already has a couple of packages on which it depends. For example, React. And we're just adding one more package here. For that, you should quit your development server with Ctrl-C and run npm install --save styled-components inside of this project folder. Now this will download this package and store it in the node modules folder, and thereafter you'll be able to use it in this project. So let's wait for this to finish. Yep, here it is. And with this finished, you can restart the server with npm start. So now how do we use this package? Of course, you can learn all about it on the official page, but I will simply introduce you to it step by step. Now let's pick a place where we do want to use it. And let's say we want to style our button. We actually already have a button component, but we really only created this button component, if we're honest, because we wanted to have some default styling for a button. Nothing wrong with this approach, but here we could also use the styled components package to achieve this in a bit of an easier way. Now, how would we do this? We could rebuild our button here by creating a new constant button. And now what we store in there is not a functional component, but instead we now import styled from styled-components. This import is now available since you installed the package. We can get rid of that button CSS import, and instead now we use styled.button, and then we add two backticks like this. Now that certainly is a super weird syntax, and chances are you haven't seen that before. This is called a tagged template literal. It's a default JavaScript feature. It's not specific to this package, not specific to React. You could use it in any JavaScript project. And now what does this do? Well, button is simply a method on this styled object. Styled is an object we're importing from styled components, and there we can access the button method. It's just a special kind of method, you could say. Instead of being a method which you call like this, with parentheses, you add these strange backticks after it. And again, that's just a default JavaScript syntax which is supported by JavaScript. In the end, this will be executed as a method behind the scenes, and what you pass in here will be passed into this method just in a special way. If you want to learn more about this tagged template literal syntax, you find a link attached where you can learn more. Here, I don't want to waste your time since we won't need to know the internals here to proceed. For the moment, we just need to know that what we pass between these two backticks will kind of end up in that button method. And this button method, and that's the interesting part, will return a new button component. Actually, that styled package has methods for all HTML elements. It has a p method for a paragraph, h1, h2, and so on for the h1, h2 tags, div to create a div, and so on. It's all there, and here we need the button. So this overall expression will return a button, but a button with the styles we provide between these two backticks. The cool thing about the backtick syntax is that you can write a multi-line string like this, so you can split this across multiple lines without any extra syntax. And now we can just copy all the button styles here and add them in here. We'll need to tweak them, but that is something we can do. Now, what do we need to do to make this work in the end? This will return a button, and this button won't have a class of button because we have no place where we would set up this class name. So instead, the styles we pass between the opening and closing backtick will directly affect this button. You therefore get rid of any selectors like this, and instead just paste in your styles just like that. And they will be added to the button element, which is returned by this method call, which is then stored in this button constant. Now for pseudo selectors, you can use the ampersand symbol. That's supported by that styled component package. This tells the package that you want to have a special case, a special pseudo selector in this case here, for this component which is created here. So in this case, we're saying, hey, when this button here has focus, please apply this style. We can do the same here for hover. So and:hover and:active. And this should now give us a button which has these styles. Now the button which is returned also by default applies all the props you might be passing to your own button component, which we're exporting here in the end. So we can still add an on-click prop, we can still set the type. That will all be forwarded by the styled components package to that core built-in button, which we previously wrapped or used ourselves, which is now used internally by this button method. We can now get rid of the React import up there because we're not dealing with JSX in this file anymore. And if we now save this, we should see that our application looks and works exactly as it did before. So this still works, but this is now our styled button. Now we can tell that there is something different if we inspect it in the developer tools. Of course, it's a regular button. That's what this button method here in the end returns. But you see on that, there is a very strange class, two strange classes to be precise. And these are class names we certainly didn't set up. These are class names dynamically generated by the styled components package. Because what this package does in the end is it looks at the styles we set up here, and then it wraps these styles into generated class names, where it guarantees that every class name is unique so that it can't spill over to other components of the app. And it will then add these classes as global CSS. But now, since we have unique class names for every styled component, the styled setup here will never be able to affect another component in the app, because these unique class names are really, well, unique per styled component. So that's how the styling is applied here, and that's how styled components work. Now, of course, we can also use styled components when we want to set up something dynamic.